Oh, hi, I'm Bey Logan. Welcome to the Hong Kong Legends DVD release of Hand of Death, aka Countdown in Kung Fu, also known in Cantonese as Siulam Mun or Shaolin Men. Siulam or Shaolin means it refers to the temple, the famous Kung Fu temple in China. Siulam is the Cantonese pronunciation, and Shaolin is the more commonly heard one in the West. And it's the same temple that you saw in the Shaw Brothers film 36th Chamber of Shaolin that you saw in the TV series, the Kung Fu TV series in America. And in this case, Mun or men is gate, but it's not like a gateway in a literal gateway, like a doorway somewhere. It's a doorway to excellence in martial arts study or study of Buddhism or study in life in general. And you see this term used many times in terms of like the martial world. For example, Fist of Fury, the Bruce Lee movie Fist of Fury, the actual name in Chinese is Zheng Mo Mun. And in that case, it's like the Mun is a doorway and Zheng is excellent, Mo is martial. So it's the doorway to excellence in martial arts. There's also a very famous comic book called Lung Fu Mun, Dragon Tiger Gate, which we're preparing to make a movie of later in the year. And again, that's the use of the word gate rather than saying a martial arts school. Now, this opening sequence we're seeing here, all shot on location in Taiwan. This is our bad guy, James Chen Jun, who we're seeing from the rear here. I'd actually had thought the whole of the film was shot in Korea, but actually this opening sequence was shot in Taiwan. And it's a curiously depopulated film throughout, and even here at the opening, I mean, there's a sense that this is a Shaolin, that this is a kind of a very sparsely populated Shaolin temple. The guy on the left is a Taiwanese actor playing the abbot. The guy on the right is Wilson Tong Wai-sing, who you'll see in such films as When Taekwondo Strikes, 36th Chamber of Shaolin, Iron Monkey, Shaolin Challenges India. There's Sammo Hung, action director and bad guy with those fantastic teeth. And the voiceover you're hearing here describing the history of Shaolin, if you hear the English version, the English dub version, is a gentleman called Rick Thomas, who's like the emperor of Hong Kong film dubbers. And so his voice is very familiar to anybody who's seen too many Kung Fu movies, as I have. So you have these Shaolin being wiped out by the invading Manchu, and actually the guys who are invading and the guys who are being shot pretty much are the same stuntmen and extras, but they just kind of reverse the shots and put them in different costumes. Here's Sammo. He's using very similar Southern boxing techniques to the ones he used in his directorial debut, Iron Fisted Monk, but this time he's on the bad side of the law. He's against evil. This is kind of against the red in a way. They always used to have little sequences at the beginning of Kung Fu movies shot against a red background. So there you had Sammo against the red brick wall. So that was kind of a little, maybe a reference to Against the Red. It's James Chen Jun, who was in the Bruce Lee movies and also the Law Wei films that Jackie Chan shot in Taiwan for the director Law Wei, who directed Bruce Lee's Big Boss and Fist of Fury. And so Wilson Tong, a great-looking guy and a very nice man in real life, and somebody who never really broke into the first rank of Kung Fu movie stars. And this is kind of like a little cheat here, because the way it's set up at the beginning is you kind of think he's going to be the star of the film, because we see him with the abbot, and he's wearing white and everybody else is wearing black, so you get a sense that this is somebody quite special to the Shaolin Temple. But really, it's just setting up the power of our main bad guy, played by James Tien. James Tien had started off his career as a good guy actor at Golden Harvest and had been in the movies like Big Boss, Fist of Fury with Bruce Lee, and then been in almost all the Kung Fu pictures they shot during that era. And then as he aged, kind of evolved into a bad guy, which is the role he played in most of the movies with Jackie. Here's Sammo, and always a pleasure to watch Sammo move. I mean, I don't know anybody who can apply Southern technique on film the way Sammo can. By Southern technique, I mean Wing Chun and Hung Gar. So that's freeze frame at the end there and the end of Wilson Tong. And now we shift to Korea, and all of the rest of the movie is actually shot on location in Korea. And the reason that that Golden Harvest always shot overseas during this era was because it is so expensive. There was so little space in Hong Kong in terms of studio space. So you go to Korea and you could have this big panorama. This temple is actually the Kongling Temple, which is about 2 hours out of Seoul. Kongling is a stupa. A stupa is like a stone burial mound, and it was you see them at Shaolin Temple in China, and you see them at temples throughout Korea. There are thousands of temples in Korea, and this particular one was famous for its stupas. And all of the temple scenes that we see in the movie were shot at the same place at Kongling Temple. That's actually the Cantonese pronunciation of the temple. It's, as I mentioned, 2 hours out from Seoul. This was the third film from the director John Woo, who of course would go on to become legendary in film circles, primarily for shooting gangster films, for his gunplay gangster films. But at this stage of his career, he was really still finding his way, and the Golden Harvest weren't quite sure what to do with him. And he was shooting kung fu pictures, and then went on to shoot comedy, and was described at one time as the new king of comedy. Here we are introducing our leading man, Durian Tan, Tan Tao Liang, a.k.a. Durian Tan. For some reason, he's often billed on these movies as Dorian, but the name he himself uses for his English name is Delon, named after Alain Delon. And one reason that they may have changed it is that in some territories, Dick Long, the Shaw Brothers actor turned gunplay star who would have his career revived by John Woo, was also known as Delon. So maybe to avoid confusion, there's the double title, Hand of Death, a.k.a. Countdown in Kung Fu. And it was also released in Germany as Dragon Forever, which is a bit confusing because there's another movie far later in their careers which has Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan and Yuen Biao, which is called Dragons Forever. But that was the German title. So here we have like a combination of the southern fist techniques and the northern leg. I mean, for those of you who may be not familiar with Chinese martial arts, they're principally divided into southern and northern. Southern using fist technique, northern using the leg, and also internal and external. So we kind of get demonstrations of all aspects of Chinese martial arts in this film, with the choreography supplied by Sammo, who at that time was, the action director of choice of Golden Harvest, and was really doing the action choreography for all the movies, and not just the martial arts pictures, but even the comedies. I mean, the big hit of this year, the year this film came out, 1976, was not, unfortunately, Hand of Death, but it was Private Eyes, a movie starring the Hui brothers, who were like this kind of three brothers who were very famous comedians in Hong Kong. And Sammo did the action for that movie as well. However, John Woo did have a big hit in 1976, but it was The Princess Changping, which was a filmed version of a Chinese opera. So that really worked for him. And this movie really came across, I think, to audiences as being a lower budget version of a Cheung Jit movie. Cheung Jit being this kind of legendary, the John Ford of Shaw Brothers, this legendary Shaw Brothers director. So this came across, I think, to audiences as being a rather pale copy of his kind of films, and it was really at a time when John Woo was discovering his own style. And I think now, when we watch the movie, there's a lot of things to enjoy because we see the early work of Sammo and Jackie and John Woo and even Yuen Biao. So it becomes almost like a Rosetta Stone, so we can interpret some of their later work. That was a fantastic chance to see the kicking techniques of Tan Tao Liang. I mean, he really was right up there as one of the best bootmen in the business. Bootmen's a phrase that's used by the big-time fans of kung fu cinema to describe somebody who's really good at kicking. And he was great with either leg. And all the way through this movie, you actually get to see Yuen Biao, who was an Chinese opera school brother of Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung, and later became a kung fu star in his own right. And he is used periodically on both sides of the law, both on the good guys and the bad guys side, whenever you need somebody to do really acrobatic fighting techniques. Durian Tan here, not really an expert in weapons, so Sammo obviously had to work with him on the pole, and later we see him using the sword, but these aren't weapons that you see in classical Taekwondo training. He was actually an expert in Taekwondo, which is the Korean national sport, and emphasizes primarily kicking techniques. Look at the good old Qing dynasty duct tape there around the ends of the spears. But Durian Tan, a very quick study physically, also worked with Sammo on movies like The Himalayan and used a variety of different techniques. I mean, this is one thing about anybody out there who wants to be in kung fu movies. There's Yuen Biao as one of the Shaolin opponents, and later you see him as one of the Manchu warriors. So he's kind of he knows no loyalty. But anyway, anybody who wants to be in kung fu movies, you have to be able to use a variety of different skills. So you have to be able to use your hands, your feet, weapons, and everything else. You can't just come in and say, I'm an expert in Taekwondo and just kick. So you see how Durian Tan comes in here and combining these kind of very classical Chinese fighting techniques with the kicks that he was doing in Korean Taekwondo. And Sammo at this time was also going under he had like a stage name of Zhu Yuanlong. And the reason that he had Yun in his name was because the instructor of Sammo, Jackie, and Yuen Biao at the Chinese opera school was Sifu Yu Jim Yun. And so as respect to him, all the students actually had a Yun name. And some of them kept them throughout their careers, like Yuen Biao, Yun Da, Yun Hua. Sammo was Yun Long, but for whatever reason, he decided to go back to his given name, which is Honggambo or Hongjinbao, or Sammo Hung, as we more readily know him today. And it's notice here, this is kind of a sign of things to come as the name for John Woo, Wu Yusheng, turns red. And obviously bloodshed was going to be his thing. Heroic bloodshed particularly was going to be his, was really going to make his name. So it's kind of telling that you have the white letters turning to red. The locations here in Korea, as I mentioned before, Golden Harvest never really had a very big backlot, unlike Shaw Brothers. So Shaw Brothers, when they shot this kind of movie, they just went out their back door at Clearwater Bay, and they had the lake and all the rolling countryside, and they could shoot this kind of thing easily. Golden Harvest, it was very difficult. So on some of the movies, they shot interior work in Golden Harvest studios in Hong Kong, and exteriors in Korea and Taiwan and elsewhere. For this movie, the whole film was shot, apart from the opening in Taiwan, was shot on location in Korea. And this was many of the actors like Sammo and Jackie spent months and months in Korea and even learned. I mean, Sammo to this day speaks pretty good Korean, and his first wife actually was from Korea, and he met her during this period. So a lot of these guys were spending long lengths of time in Korea because there was no space to shoot in Hong Kong. And the funny thing was, at that time, when they saw Korean people shooting movies, they would be kind of laughing, because at that time, Korean cinema really wasn't even on the radar in terms of world cinema, and Hong Kong films were all the rage. But I guess Korea had the last laugh, because right now I would say Korean cinema is way more hot than Hong Kong cinema, which is unfortunate, but those of us working in the business are doing our best to make a fresh wave of films that'll put us back on center stage. The gentleman playing the abbot here is actually a Korean actor who was, and wherever they were like kind of supporting roles to fill during this era, they would actually find locally based actors, and they would be speaking Korean, and the Chinese actors would speak Chinese, and because they weren't recording sound, this really wasn't an issue. And then the film would come back to Hong Kong, would be edited in Hong Kong by Peter Chung Yi-jung, who was the kind of in-house editor at that time at Golden Harvest, and he would edit the film, and then afterwards they would dub the film into whatever language was needed: Cantonese, Mandarin, English, Korean, and distribute it internationally. And I always think that's one of the reasons why Hong Kong cinema has such high energy, is because dialogue scenes only took like a couple of takes, and you could shoot all the dialogue in a day, because you weren't really looking for a nuanced performance in terms of people's vocal delivery, because there was no sound being recorded. Then you could spend 2 weeks on the martial arts action, and it tends to be the reverse on American movies. On American films, you spend like weeks and weeks doing all the drama and the big spectacle, and then they give you like a day to shoot the martial arts fights, and that's probably why for many years the martial arts in American movies weren't really going to par with those in Hong Kong cinema. And Durian Tan, Tan Tao Liang, was born 1947 in Busan, Korea, where there's actually to this day a very famous film festival. And Busan's kind of a coastal city of Korea. Taekwondo expert. He also trained other kung fu stars, including John Liu, Yun Bu, and years later, the daughter of Bruce Lee, Shannon Lee. And he was running, he runs a Taekwondo studio now in Monterey Park in California. So he's another person who actually went on from working in cinema to running a martial arts school thereafter, and kind of moved on from the film industry. I think that there were a whole string of kung fu martial arts experts who came in the industry under Sammo's guidance at this time, who were great at kicking, like Casanova Wong, and they had their moment in the sun and then went on to do other kinds of business. Again, this is another location, very famous location that we see in Korea, and the great thing about Korea was, because it's got this ancient history, it's really kind of on a border with China, and there's like a shared history and a shared written language that you could easily pass off Korea as ancient China. And here is our guy, Jackie Chan, pre-eye job, looking very much like his son JC, because JC has the same pre-operation eyes that Jackie has. It was kind of a thing at that time. If you wanted to become a big star in Asia, you really had to have, you had your eyes done. You couldn't have those kind of eyes. And this is before Jackie had if you see him in like his big breakthrough film, Snake and the Eagle Shadow, he actually had a cosmetic operation to make his eyes a bit bigger. And this is a really Jung Jit thing. This shot in an American movie probably would be between a guy and a girl, but Jung Jit was always about, who was the mentor of John Woo at Shaw Brothers, Chang Che, was all about the kind of the bond of chivalry between brothers, and women tended to be just a nuisance, or somebody got in the way of the relationship between the brothers. And I don't think, I won't go any further down that path because there's been a lot of kind of critical discourses about the real meaning of all that. But anyway, this really speaks to that because they got this unspoken communication between these two guys, and it's very, very much John Woo kind of referencing his master's voice, the work that he'd been doing as an assistant director to Chung Jie when he was working at Shaw Brothers. Now, there's a story that Jackie Chan's role here was originally intended for a Korean actor, and then John Woo looked at the guy's movement and his kung fu and decided to get rid of him, that he wasn't up to scratch for what he wanted for the role, and so they brought in Jackie Chan instead. Sammo Hung remembers that Jackie was cast from the outset, so it's possible that John Woo actually had a discussion about a Korean actor before Sammo came on board, or it could be that just the story about the Korean actor was something that was kind of just circulated in error. There's Jackie pulling those kind of faces that really he would use to great use later in his comedy career. This film is by no means a comedy, but Jackie does get a few comedic moments, and that's why I think of this as kind of the Rosetta Stone, because you look here, you can see the elements of Jackie that would make him a star, and you also, I guess, you can also see the reasons why this film didn't perform as expected, or why there are some choices made for this film that don't really work, and some that do. But it's fascinating to see Jackie already, even within the context of this very straight-laced film, bringing in some comedic aspects, and that's what will be recognized in him, why he would be cast in Snake in the Shadow and Drunken Master and become the big star that he did. Strange fruit here hanging from the tree. I'm sure many of you listening to this commentary will have seen many Hong Kong kung fu movies. Just to kind of reprise the period we're talking about now, the indigenous Ming people of China had their emperor usurped by the Qing, who were like backed by the Manchus from the north, and the Qing regime are very bullying and have mistreated the Han people. The hairstyle that you see them wear with the queue, this was something, the ponytail, this was something that was forced upon the Han people. The Manchus were horsemen, and they thought that this hairstyle kind of resembled the back of their horses. So that's actually where it came from. Normally they used to have the front of the head shaved as well, but in this movie you don't see that. You actually see everybody with full head of hair and the ponytail behind. But that was the backstory, the historical backstory. And again, it's kind of interesting because Korea was also, as I'll talk a bit about later, Korea was also involved in the battle between the Qing and the Ming, the ongoing fight between the Qing and the Ming, because there's such a long interwoven history between Korea and China, which makes it particularly interesting that this movie should be shot on location there. So Jackie at this time, Sammo was far better established at this time than Jackie Chan. So here's a sense of Jackie really coming into the industry and under the wing of his elder brother, his elder opera school brother. And a very interesting conversation I had the other day with a French writer, and he was saying that if you go back to look at the history of the black and white comedians, Fatty Arbuckle and Buster Keaton, that you actually see a lot of comparison between the career of those actors and those of Sammo and Jackie, and that's really interesting and a kind of area of research that I've never looked at, but I certainly will, because Keaton also came into the industry under the auspices of Fatty Arbuckle, and Arbuckle's obviously a big, fat, athletic man, and so is Sammo. So it was kind of like there's a lot of similarities, and people always talked about Jackie's having kind of like echoes of the old silent comedians, but I've never really, seen that pursued in any kind of scholarly manner. Again, a part of the heroic bloodshed lineage. I mean, heroic bloodshed as a genre is something that was defined by John Woo using gunplay, and he's doing films like A Better Tomorrow and The Killer and Hard Boiled, and those are like the heroic bloodshed films. But really the origins of heroic bloodshed are in these Gong Woo films, the swordplay movies, where you actually saw this sense of respect, of yihei, of honor and chivalry between the brothers, and that led itself into that was kind of like reinvented by John Woo as gangster movies, as gunplay films. Here we are in this kind of, it's not a spaghetti western town. It's really hard to believe anybody actually lives here because it's such a deserted, it's got this kind of spaghetti western feel to it. And almost deserted. And this is really because the budget of the film was really not very high, and so they couldn't afford huge numbers of extras. So they had enough money to build these sets, but really not to hire a lot of people to run around. I suppose one rationale is they've all been killed off by the bad guys. But the film does feel curiously depopulated, and something that's been mentioned in several reviews of the film, there never seemed to be quite enough people. But again, this was something that you saw in the spaghetti westerns as well. So in this instance, I think it's probably a budget indication rather than an aesthetic concern. The guys in the background, they're wearing the classic uniforms that you see worn by the Qing army, and you see very similar outfits in the old Shaw Brothers movies. And there's Sammo. Now, it's funny, the big hit of this year I mentioned was Private Eyes. And in Private Eyes, Michael Hoy, in disguise, wears teeth very similar to the ones that Sammo is sporting in these shots. And so I don't know whether he borrowed these teeth from Michael Hoy or Benny Hill. But Sammo's teeth, I think, probably one of the more memorable characters in the movie. This, I thought, a bit of a reach that... given the circumstances, Durian Tan so quickly trusts this guy who's given him no kind of signal that he's genuinely a good guy. The actor here is Chu Ching, a.k.a. Chin Chi Chu, who was also a bad guy in the movie Skyhawk, King Boxer, When Taekwondo Strikes. He's a Korean actor. His real name is Kim, but he was given a Chinese name because he was working on a number of Chinese movies. King Boxer, of course, was directed by Cheng Chang-ho, who was actually a Korean director. As was Skyhawk, so obviously he preferred to work with Korean actors. When Taekwondo Strikes was shot entirely on location, directed by Hwang Fung, and with Sammo as the action director and actor, was shot entirely on location in Korea as well, and so he was in that. So there was kind of a case to be made when shooting in Korea, use as many Korean actors as possible, and at the same time really occasionally actors from Korea we brought over to work in Hong Kong because they had acting skills and specific martial arts skills. They're throwing down there that white card. You see that again a lot in these films of this era. That signifies an order to execute, and you see that in courts when the judge passed sentence, he would throw down like a tablet like that with the sentence written on it, whether it was death or beating or imprisonment. So that kind of signifies the fact that this is not a murder, it's actually a legal execution. This is the first time we see the 5 bodyguards, or the team of bodyguards of James Tien's character going into action. And later we see them all fighting with Tan Tao Liang. But this is kind of like just a little preview, so we get to see the specialities of each member of the group. And again, very much... now it's kind of stereotypical to the genre, but this time they're really defining kung fu cinema in that era of filmmaking in the 1970s. So these ideas were like being put on screen for the first time. A little bit of the Bruce Lee for Sammo's movements just then. He had that kind of bam, the Bruce Lee impact here. No one's a better on-screen Bruce Lee guy than Sammo, and I don't know whether consciously or unconsciously sometimes put these little touches in there. But if you go back and look at that clip a couple of times, the way he reacts to hitting the guys after he's hit the guys, he's got a little bit of the Lei Siu Long about it. And this is an amazing performance by an actor who kind of slipped through the cracks. This is Young Wei, sometimes billed erroneously on reviews as Chang Jung. A supporting actor, never really a star. I mean, he's normally in bad guy kung fu fighting roles. And John Woo, obviously, when he met the guy, saw something in him that fit his image of this kind of haunted swordsman. And I think he's wonderful in the film, and it's a shame he was never given more to do. You see him in films like Wu Ma's Deaf Mute Heroine, Hapkido, John Woo's film The Dragon Tamers, The Tournament, Shaolin Plot, which is a Sammo movie from Golden Harvest. Warriors 2, he has a pretty strong role. He's the spearman in Warriors 2, one of the bad guys in Warriors 2. And he's also in Magnificent Butcher. And that was about it for him. He really didn't ever rise to become a lead. Again, this is his sole leading role. And I guess because the film didn't perform very well, there was a sense of, okay, well, we won't do any more films with him starring. But he was I think it's interesting that John Woo, later in his career, would do the same with Chow Yun-fat, who was kind of a failed actor, Dick Lung, who was washed up at the time, and brought them back into Better Tomorrow. And John Woo would basically look in every marketplace to find actors who were good alter egos for him, and he found them in Hong Kong with Chow Yun-fat and Dick Lung, and he found them and also Tony Leung Chiu-wai, and then later when he went to America he would find John Travolta and Nicolas Cage, actors he would work with repeatedly because he felt that they were appropriate cinematic alter egos for him. So there's another quick chance there to see this extraordinary flexibility and sharp kicking skills of Tan Tao Liang. Great reactions from the stuntmen, of course, as well. I often think, you could bear in mind, no matter how good the guy's kicks are, you need somebody to react to it. And I've seen a lot of movies where people have executed really impressive technique and they didn't look strong because the stuntmen were not sufficiently gifted to react with that kind of snap and timing. This is another kind of like very Jung-Jeet relationship, the idea that the bad guy kind of really develops an affinity for the star, for this hero. He kind of like sees this physical skill that the guy has, and really beyond a safe. Beyond the point of safety, he's kind of like, keen to make him one of the bad guy team. And you see this happening like later in the film, that Sammo's character is really so impressed by the physical skills and demeanor of Young Wei that he kind of like, even after he's proved to be like a snake in the grass, still wants to keep him on the team. I just love those teeth. The great Sammo's always got this kind of thing. He always wants to kind of change his appearance. If you look at all his movies, he's always getting a black eye or bruised or in some way disfigured, and he always loves to play with his own image. His Young Wei with the sword, the classic swordsman figure. And again, this is kind of a blending in the way, because you had two strands of films at Shaw Brothers. You had the kung fu movies and you had sword play. And this kind of brings the two together, because you have someone like Tan Tao Liang, who's using martial art techniques like kung fu fighting techniques, or taekwondo, and then you have Young Wei's character who's using the sword. And it was unusual. Normally you'd have swordplay films and you would have kung fu movies, but this is kind of blending the two, because Young Wei's a master of the game of the Chinese straight sword, and so you have a classical swordsman inside of in a kung fu movie. A lot of people refer to Hong Kong cinema like martial arts films as one encompassing genre, but in fact there are two separate, you can actually trace two very separate streams of filmmaking, which is swordplay and kung fu films. But this kind of brings the two together, and again references the fact that John Woo had learnt so much at the feet of Chang Che or Jung-Jeet, because Jung-Jeet was equally excellent at working on making both kinds of films. John Woo worked with Chang Che on the movies Water Margin in 1971, Boxer from Shandong also in the same year, Four Riders in 1972, and Blood Brothers in 1973. And he was really very strongly influenced by the themes and the style of Jung-Jeet. But what I think he found out with this movie was you couldn't just take that and start making pseudo Chang Che films at Golden Harvest. You had to find a way to take those themes and take those ideas and give them some fresh relevance. And it wasn't until he did A Better Tomorrow that he really found his own métier, and then kind of completely redefined Hong Kong action cinema, and in fact world cinema, because after that you had everybody firing double guns and all the slow motion, all the stuff that John Woo brought in at that time. He'd actually made his directorial debut with a movie called The Young Dragons in 1973, but it actually took 2 years for the film to be re-edited and music put to it to be finally released by Golden Harvest. And he also shot another martial arts film, also with the bad guy from this film, James Tien, called The Dragon Tamers, which was shot in Korea. And that film also was re-edited and had footage reshot for Golden Harvest, as was a later film, Hero Shed No Tears, which was a Vietnam era action thriller that was shot in Thailand. And this is kind of, again, this is very much in keeping with the established genre, that the idea that the swordsman is brought low by his love for a woman. And it was, at that time, if you were following the way of the sword, you really didn't have any time for love. I mean, you see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that's really what's between one of the elements that stops Chow Yun-fat being together with Michelle Yeoh, is that they're swordsmen. Very rare, even see this very brief nudity in a John Woo film. I mean, he's been very, you see some of it in The Dragon Tamers, also shot in Korea. But he's normally very, as it befits perhaps his Christian upbringing, he's normally very reserved about showing any kind of sensuality or sexuality, and his films, better known for the Bond of Brothers and the action sequences. But in this film we have that kind of the brief moment that we just saw. There's this idea that if you're a swordsman, that you're really, you're in love with your sword and you're following a path. These films, they follow the rules of the Gongwu or the Jianghu. Jianghu Gongwu is like a river. Basically, it's a river, and the river is like a metaphorical river down which flow all the masters of martial arts and the swordsmen and the monks and all the figures that you see in the classic fiction of this era, which were originally you saw them in books like The Three Kingdoms, and later you see it you see it in films. This whole genre of films that everybody's following a certain set of rules and basically living and dying by the sword. And that Gongwu kind of continued on into the modern gangster films with the same ideas, but not with swords, but with guns and choppers and all the things that gangsters use in the modern era. Here we are in the flashback sequence, which reveals how Young Wei became this lost man who basically sits drunk and playing the flute. And of course, it's because of a woman. And it's like always in Chang Che's movies, in Zheng Ji's movies at Shaw Brothers, always a woman who brought the swordsman low. If you look at The One-Armed Swordsman, the film that put Wong Yu on the map, Jimmy Wong Yu, he learns the sword all these years, and then finally the woman betrays him, and his arm is cut off. And so he becomes the one-armed swordsman. But that's really and of course eventually becomes a great swordsman even though he only has one arm. But the thing is that he is brought low originally by the fact that he allows a woman to get close to him. And this is kind of a recurring theme. And Chang Che never really liked to have female. It was kind of like it was popular at the time to have swordswomen as leading characters, and he was never really into that. He liked to see basically male heroes and women as an obstacle, really, to whatever the males wanted to do. There's a tiger technique being used by Sammo, and again, even though he's a bad guy and is really perceived as being not as strong as the other leading players, it's always a pleasure to see him busting loose. And I've been fortunate to be working with him the last few weeks on a movie called Dragon Squad, and in terms of his classical kung fu movements, he still has it. I mean, it's really a joy to see. I mean, he's one of the few people of this era who really went out to seek out different masters and different exponents of different styles and learn how to physically apply on screen Wing Chun, Hung Gar, Tai Chi, and all different martial arts styles. So you have this kind of tragic denouement of this particular scene, and we see there the kind of bloody palm, which is indicating immediately the kind of power that James Tien's character has. James Tien, actually from an opera background, was not a martial artist per se, but he had that kind of physicality. And when he came to work at Golden Harvest, he was originally meant to be the lead in the movie The Big Boss, and got pushed to the side by Bruce Lee and never really recovered from that. He was always going to be like second string after that. But I think he really, in this film particularly, under Sammo's guidance, has a very strong physical presence, and also John Woo gives him some great dialogue later, so he's a very powerful bad guy, both physically and in terms of his screen presence. So it's quite a memorable role from James Tien. So this is like Young Wei. Again, I mean, really, I think his performance in this movie, it's a shame, when you see him perform in the movie, it's a shame he didn't get a chance to do something more memorable in the film. It's interesting here seeing James Tien's character says, he's broken his spirit, so you don't need to kill the man. So we see, even though he is the bad guy, he has levels of perception, and he's not a simplistic killing machine. He's actually the thinking man's bad guy. And this was something that John Woo really brought into the film. I mean, all the action sequences, we can say, were Sammo. Though, it's interesting, I was doing an interview with Jackie for Jackie Chan My Stunts, and he talked about working on this movie, working with John Woo and actually helping Sammo to set up some of the action sequences, and coming in the night before and really mapping everything out start to finish. And at the end of it, the next day, John Woo would come in and Jackie would say, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. And John Woo would just go, oh, okay, sounds good. And then they would shoot it. And I think that's pretty much how it was at those times. It was really the action directors really had final say on where the cameras were put, the film speed, the cutting, and all of these aspects. And the main unit director may not even have been on the set when they were shooting the action scenes. They were either shooting 2 units, or the drama director would have been off preparing for the next dramatic sequences. So the action stuff would be completely left in the hands of Sammo, who would be helped out by Jackie and Yun Bu and the other team members that he had working with him. And in many of the Golden Harvest films of this era, these kind of interiors would have been shot at Golden Harvest. But here, everything's shot, all the interiors are in Korea. There's the hand signal there. Again, something that you see a lot in the old Shaw Brothers movies about the Ming versus the Qing. There's specific hand signals that reveal that you're a brother member of the Ming revolutionaries. And this was something, because the triads were, this is one of the reasons that this Gongwu cinema kind of went on from being swordplay to being gangster movies, because the triads actually claim allegiance to these old revolutionaries and use a lot of the similar hand signals and methods of communication. So this is why they, to this day, there's like a sense that, this is actually one consistent genre of filmmaking. And there's a movie recently was released called Gong Wu, which was a gangster film with Andy Lau and Jackie Cheung, and again with these guys as modern day sword heroes in the gangster era. It's back at the Kongling Temple. Very distinctive, these stone statues. You see many movies shot during this era, Hong Kong films shot in Korea during this era, they use this particular location. This shooting day for night. This is actually meant to be set at night time, but the filters are very light filters, so I never really feel in this movie that we convincingly feel that this is actually meant it's nighttime. The reason they do that is it's so much cheaper to shoot by day because you haven't got to light the whole sequence. You haven't got to have big generators with these huge arc lights making it look like daylight. So making it so you can see everything at night. So what they would do is not just in Asia but throughout the world, there was a sense at these times to make life easy. You would shoot in daylight and then put these filters on the camera, so it would like be shooting what they call day for night. But in this instance, I have to say it's kind of a pale green day for night. Now, Durian Tan Liang also stars in The Himalayan, which was directed by the journeyman director Huang Feng, one of the prolific directors of Golden Harvest in this era. And also he's in movies like The Hot, the Cool and the Vicious, Tattoo Connection, which was opposite Jim Kelly, who was in the film Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And Tattoo Connection is also known as The Black $6 Million Man, which I think is one of the great titles of B-movie history. And he actually produced a movie called Breathing Fire, which starred Bolo Yeung, who also was in Enter the Dragon, and Ke Huy Quan from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. But he didn't appear in the film. He actually just produced it, and it was shot on location in the States and released on video around the world. Kind of a, fun movie. You have to feel for Sammo, by the way, because obviously in the heat of the Korean summer, as you can tell from the fact that he's so deeply tanned for much of the movie, but he has to wear these kind of the robes of office and the hat, and particularly when you fight, much more comfortable if you're wearing the loose cotton clothes of some of the other characters. But if you have to wear the full Mandarin gear, the kind of the clothes of a Qing official, it actually made performing action sequences all the more cumbersome, all the more difficult. But Durian Tan, as I say, one of the people like Casanova Wong, Wong Jan-lee, these guys who were brought over to do films in Hong Kong, or to do Hong Kong films, let's say, and had a quick run when that was kind of in the 70s, when that was the thing, to have real martial artists doing martial arts movies. But then as the industry progressed into the 80s, that became less common. So most of the Korean actors either moved back to Korea, as Casanova Wong did, or moved to the States, which is what Durian Tan did. And he's like, I did hear that he'd moved back to Taiwan. He'd moved to Taiwan. I'm not sure about that, but certainly as far as Sammo could remember, the last time he was in LA, the Durian Tan's or rather Delon Tan, as he calls himself, Delon Tan's dojang, his taekwondo school, was actually still running in Monterey Park. So here's again, you can never get this in Hong Kong. There's a wonderful temple here. We're still at the Gongling Temple. This is all the same temple shot from different sides. This always looks to me like it could be a kind of a court on which you could play badminton or something like that. It's kind of a big open sports field. And this classic kind of opportunity to show off the bad guy, introduce the bad guy again, and to show off his team of bad guys. When I look at video games, I often think, they owe such an obvious debt to Hong Kong cinema because these movies are always have like different bad guys coming out with different specific skills, and it's like matching one against the other, which is the classic format for bash 'em up video games. And here's great. The camera moving in now, you really get to see the start of John Woo's kind of getting his language together as a director. This is bowing down, man soy, man soy, man soy. The kind of that bow is wishing long life to the Lord. And James Tien really carrying off this character with, I think, great presence, great gravitas. And he's the guy who immediately sees through the fact that Durian Tan is not who he seems to be, who he's purporting to be, that he's actually trying to infiltrate their order. So there's no period of time when he's kind of allowed to come in and work alongside the Manchu. He sees him straight off and sees into his soul, and that's kind of an interesting choice, because a lot of the times in these films you actually had somebody successfully become a member of the evil order and then be conflicted because he had to supposedly fight against his brethren, and instead of which here, right off the bat, he's revealed to be a bad guy, and so we get to show off the skills, the various skills. Rather, he's a bad guy as far as James Chen is concerned, but a good guy for us, and he's revealed to be an infiltrator. But I think the dialogue sequence here, I mean, in terms of blending the specific skills of John Woo and Sammo Hung, this is a good example of that, because you have this really quite elegant Chinese dialogue back and forward between them as they kind of playing this verbal sparring match, which then evolves into the physical showdown. And I think this is, Kung Fu, this is not perhaps the most perfectly realized example of that, but it kind of shows the direction in which quality Kung Fu cinema would move, which is to balance the two. And years later, you would have your Once Upon a Time in China and Iron Monkey in those films, where you had elegant dialogue and characterization and stunning action sequences juxtaposed, and that really, this is kind of foreshadowing that, but it's as yet not completely realized. So that's probably why the film did not perform as it was hoped to perform at the box office. It was released on the 15th of July 1976 and didn't even hit the top 10 chart of the films for that year. But it was later, of course, now it's received worldwide re-release, largely on the back of Jackie Chan appearing in a supporting role. But of course, he's kind of like, now the marketing quite rightly kind of positions the fact that, hey, this film has got Jackie and Sammo, and I don't think the fact that Durian Tan is starring in the film is really a strong selling point. So it's really sold as being Jackie and Sammo, and also in a lesser role Yuen Biao. So it's become more interesting over time. And of course, for John Woo, the fact that it was an early John Woo film, and John Woo has developed this huge worldwide following, particularly in France, where he's up there with Jerry Lewis and the other demigods of and Wong Kar-wai and the other demigods of French film culture. They hugely admire John Woo. Now, back in 1973, John Woo had signed a 3-year contract with Golden Harvest, and as I mentioned before, they were really not quite sure what to do with his unique talents. So he was doing films like this, and he did also a film called Last Hurrah for Chivalry, which is his kind of swordplay film, his full-on swordplay film, and again a film that's become better regarded in subsequent years. This is a very classic Hong Kong kung fu movement. Great dialogue, and also the circling movement of the two, of hero and villain. This is something you see in many subsequent and contemporary Hong Kong kung fu movies. The idea of these two guys sizing each other up. But there's interesting the change here. Normally, what happens is the hero fights his way through the henchman and then fights the main villain. In this particular sequence, he fights the main villain first, and when the main villain realizes that he's no real match, then he brings in the henchman to kind of beat him up. So this is kind of a reverse of what you would normally see in films, in genre offerings of this era. And here's again James Tien showing this kind of combination of North and Southern technique. And as I mentioned, he was not really somebody highly trained in martial arts. He also worked with John Woo on Dragon Tamers, and with Sammo he has that great cameo in Prodigal Son, where he comes back as like a one-armed fighter who gets crippled by in an amazing scene gets crippled by Frankie Chan. This is a wonderful chance again. Every time we see Durian Tan go into action, I'm so envious of the kind of the precision and height of his kicks. I mean, he was really up there with the great kickers working in Hong Kong cinema at that time. And here, this kind of really hand versus foot balance of hand versus foot techniques. And this again is kind of classic. A classic stereotype of the genre is the idea that, here he realizes his existing skill is really not up to snuff, and later will develop a specific skill so that he can counter the techniques. When you see, a moment ago then you saw, if you go back and play in slow-mo, you can see there's an acrobatic movement of Durian Tan spinning back from the fist of James Tien. That's actually Yuen Biao. And throughout the film, whenever you see anybody performing in a particularly acrobatic manner, then it's Yuen Biao. He was like Sammo's kind of like stunt performer of choice. So you always used to see every time there was somebody needed to flip, they'd be doubled by Yuen Biao. And then if you needed a supporting actor to do something acrobatic, then he'd be played by Yuen Biao. So Yuen Biao was like hardest work. There was him and James Brown. Yuen Biao, the hardest working man in show business, and certainly the hardest working man in Hong Kong show business during this era. This is kind of another classic figure, the Mongolian wrestler. The Mongols brought with them these kind of wrestling techniques from the north. So you often see, Bolo Yeung used to play those roles at Golden Harvest, the wrestler. Now the guy on the right is Yun Hua, another member of the Seven Little Fortunes, just won Best Supporting Actor for his work on Kung Fu Hustle. He was as an opera school partner of Jackie and Samo and everybody, and he's partnered up here. The other spearman is Molo Tong, who was also a Golden Harvest stuntman. A lot of films of this era, so they're paired up together. That's him on the left with the mustache. Guy with the swords coming in is To Wai War, another martial arts stunt guy. And Samo's lucky at this time with this great team. This guy with the whip is Hat Ming, who is still on Samo's stunt team, worked with us on Medallion. A really nice guy. He trained Claire Filani for that film, and he's a really sweet man, very, very warm personality, and still very good trainer with all this background he had. You see him in a lot of Shaw Brothers movies as well. Very strong background in classical martial arts. And again, if you watch carefully through this sequence, you see that for most of the kind of standing and fighting, it's Durian Tan, and then whenever you have a particularly acrobatic move, it's actually Yun Bu doubling for him for all the flips. And actually, facially, they're very good. It's a very good match. This is all Yun Bu. You see, if you look at his face, it's very hard to tell them apart when they're in motion. Sometimes, with actors, if you have a very distinctive face, the actor has a very distinctive face, it's hard to double. But in this case, there was enough similarity between Durian Tan and Yun Bu that worked very, very well. Yun Hua, who I was mentioning a moment ago with the spear, interesting, I heard a story from Samo the other day. He was saying about when they were all members of the opera school that Yun Hua did something to the altar backstage of the theatre and was haunted. I mean, he couldn't come on. One time he was about to go on stage and he got poked by an invisible finger, and was unable to go on stage and got beaten by their instructor, who was very tough with the kids at that time. And it was because he'd done something that offended the god of theatre, or maybe Guan Gong, whoever the deity was who'd been offended, and they had to perform some kind of ritual to kind of undo the harm that had been done. And so he was, after that he was okay. But that was kind of like a real Chinese ghost story from the days of the Seven Little Fortunes. So here you really have, at the beginning of the sequence, the empty hand techniques of James Tien, and then you get to see all of the bad guy team, and then you see him with his weapon of choice. So Samo, given as ever, throwing in everything but the kitchen sink. I don't think there's any movie of Samo's where he's given free rein that he doesn't throw in all ideas upon ideas and weapons and techniques and characters. And I don't know I've ever seen a movie with Samo where you thought, well, he was on his work on the film, that he was coasting. He was always trying to bring in new ideas. And even, I mentioned I was working with him at the moment for his sequences in Dragon Squad. He's always got new ideas. I remember years and years ago when my first real job was working at a magazine called Combat in England, a martial arts magazine, and the first picture I ever looked at from their film photo collection was a still from this movie, and the caption was, "Sammo Hung keeps Durian Tan hanging around," and I used it in my book Hong Kong Action Cinema. So this scene I always find particularly entertaining, and I suppose it shows my pathetic sense of humor that I actually thought that was kind of funny, and I still think it's kind of a fun moment. But it kind of looked ridiculous. Samo in the teeth and Durian Tan. It was this particular shot, and that's a still from the movie. And you see it used a lot. I think we used it. We used the exact same still in Hong Kong Action Cinema. By the way, for those of you out there who are waiting for a 10-year reissue of Hong Kong Action Cinema, you probably have to wait a bit longer because the publishers tell me there's not a sufficient market for a book on Hong Kong Action Cinema, so there's no immediate plans to re-release it. Just mention that in passing. This again, kind of like foreshadowing Jackie Chan's career as a comedic actor. And again, shooting day for night, but with these really pale filters. So it's kind of, I guess if it was black, if it was night, it would actually work a bit better. But this sequence always seems to me to be slightly ridiculous because we can see it so clearly, and because the daylight is so evident outside. It's kind of the idea that these guys could get away with this kind of escape in broad daylight. So it's kind of this broad humor of and that classic Jackie Chan expression as Durian Tan lands on him. But this, again, I guess it is being played for laughs here, but I find it slightly more ridiculous than it needs to be, because it's so evidently in broad daylight, and how the guards would not notice somebody crawling along on all fours with another guy on his back. It defies belief. But hey, these are the conventions of the Hong Kong martial arts genre, and the industry's entertaining for all that. It's kind of funny that the idea that Durian Tan can land like a cat and Jackie's not quite so graceful when you look at the relative physical skills of each one of them in terms of flipping and jumping. Jackie at that time, and to this day, extraordinary athlete with incredible movement skills. John Woo, born in Canton on the 1st of May 1946, moved to Hong Kong when he was 4 years old, and his father was a great scholar of Chinese culture. And I think that, combined with his background with the Lutherans, his education was kind of provided by the Lutheran Christian Brothers, gave him this blend of like a fascination with traditional Chinese culture and this kind of very Christian idea of sin and redemption and all the blood sacrifice and all the ideas you see throughout his work. And then overlaid on that was his exposure to European cinema, because he was fascinated by the films of Melville and Clouseau and the great French filmmakers of this era. And so you had that, plus the fact that he was watching later the Shaw Brothers movies, the Zhongjit movies. And so you had all this coming together, and at this period of John Woo's career, him trying to find the right vehicle to combine all those kind of disparate influences in an entertaining and profitable manner, and really not finding his way until he moved over, never finding his way at Golden Harvest, but moving over to Cinema City and really finding his way with A Better Tomorrow. And I think it was these films have become interesting now as kind of like they kind of pre-visualizations of the ideas that later would be would be delivered full grown in films like A Better Tomorrow and its sequel, and The Killer and Hard Boiled. All these sequences that we're seeing here in this hut were actually shot on Jeju-do, Jeju Island in Korea, and I'll talk some more about that area later, because it's a very interesting area in its own right. So here's this tinted blue flashback. This is kind of up to and including Iron Monkey. You've got the idea that if you do a flashback, you can tint it in blue to add particular resonance to it. Now, in some of the trailers for the movie, you actually get to see some of these sequences in full color without the tint. So obviously they were shot without filters. They were shot on normal film, and then later it was tinted in the editing process. But on if you look at some of this flashback, you actually get some on the trailer, the original trailer for the film. It's in color. That's Yuen Biao going down there through the table. As I mentioned, the hardest working guy in rock and roll. And there's also a movement coming up where a bad guy kind of does a backwards dive holding a sword. And again, that's Yuen Biao. That's Yuen Biao again here on the right of the frame, fighting with Sammo, getting thrown down through the table, bang. So I actually got to do that twice. There's Yuen with a spear again. And you get to see a lot of... This is actually a sequence that Jackie mentioned that he had a hand in choreographing. This is a scene where he came in the night before and then was allowed to kind of have his own way. This is Yuen Biao going backwards with the sword. And really, these days, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a movie where somebody got as many jobs to do on one film as Yuen Biao does on this film, happening with his whip chain. And the great thing about Chinese martial arts, you kind of like, if you look at American movies, you got John Wayne style punching and kicking. With Chinese martial arts, you never run out of material, because you've got hundreds of different martial art styles and all the weapons to draw on. So this is like, one thing I want to mention about this movie is we actually get to foreshadow two things. One, of course, is a little taste of Jackie's comedic skills, but also the idea that he has some reserves as a dramatic actor, which he would show in his more recent career. Particularly if you look at New Police Story, you get to see more of Jackie as like an actor's actor. And we do see some of that here, because he's playing this guy who's tortured by the death of his brother, the fact that his brother was a patriotic warrior who was killed by the Manchu. All the sword skill, all the horsemanship that you see here, all the actors at Golden Harvest in this era would learn horsemanship in Hong Kong. They didn't actually practice all this in Korea, but they were learning to use horses. There was a stable in Hong Kong where there were horses used in films, and so they would all learn to ride. So here's like pole technique, very southern style pole technique, taught to Durian Tan by Sammo Hung specifically for the film. I mean, as far as I know, Taekwondo doesn't have any weapon sets. The classical Chinese, the more classical Korean arts of Hwarangdo or even Tangsudo, which means like China hand way, did have weapons. But Taekwondo is basically just hand and foot, so you didn't have weapons as such. Kind of a little Seven Samurai motif here. The way Jackie's chopping wood. I mean, if you go back and look at Seven Samurai, there's actually a beat there. One of the characters is kind of like chopping wood. Again, kind of curiously depopulated kind of tea house in the middle of nowhere, and maybe it's the budget, informing the aesthetic. Again, all of this on Jeju Island in Korea, which is to this day a famous tourist area and an area of great natural beauty and with a key place in the history of Korea. And I've had various Korean friends over the last couple of years, and was actually dating a Korean girl for a while, and really found out a lot I didn't know about the tragic history of Korea. And I think that that really informs the cinema of Korea at this time. Like in 2005, the fact that the history of Korea really is quite a sad history. And even to this day, Korea has this split identity between North and South. So I think probably the history of the places that they're filming adds a resonance to some of the sequences that we see here in Hand of Death, because at that time the Korean cinema really hadn't come into full flower, but they were using locations, and the locations themselves had carried with them perhaps some historical resonance of events that actually had happened during this period, in the actual period being depicted in the film, during the days of the Qing dynasty. So Durian Tan, or Durian Tan, nicknamed Flash Legs, and he was actually born in Korea to a Chinese family, so his background is not of Korean blood. Began studying Taekwondo at the age of 13, and there was one of his more hokey attributes was that he was able to climb walls, so he was doing gecko kung fu. That's a classic Chanbara move, the hat and everything. This is very much relating to the Japanese Chanbara films. And forgot to mention earlier, another major influence on John Woo, of course, was Kurosawa, as I think he was an influence on any filmmaker of taste. So you do see some elements here in terms of this moment particularly is very much Chanbara. Chanbara was the Japanese version of Gongwu, and actually the word Chanbara is onomatopoeic. It goes from the sound they used to make with percussive instruments when they were playing silent samurai movies in the theaters. They would have a guy playing like percussive instruments to accompany the action, and that was the noise that they made was like Chanbara, Chanbara, so they would be called Chanbara films. Two Korean supporting guys. Again, the moment you see them coming on a screen, you go, well, these guys are going to be, where do these guys come from? Why do you trust them? There's no exchange whatsoever, and they just get embraced as brothers. And if you've seen many of these films, you go, wait a minute, these guys have been brought out of left field. They're going to be traitors. As I mentioned before, one of the more hokey attributes given to Durian Tan, to Durian Tan, was the idea of him climbing walls, gecko style, gecko being a kind of insect that we see, not an insect, a lizard, that we see in Asia. We don't get to see him do it in this movie, but there are other movies where he's doing his gecko kung fu. As a taekwondoist, he won various tournaments, and he talked about, in an interview, he was talking about how he developed his unique kicking style, because he felt that if he was so quick with one kick, he might not get awarded a point because the judges might not see one specific kicking technique. So he developed this system of like kicking repeatedly with the same leg. So he was like hopping forward. There's this hopping kick, which is something you don't see. If you look at someone like Wang In-sik, who was the bad guy in Dragon Lord and Young Master, and he really used a different kind of Korean taekwondo kicking technique. He would deliver a single kick and then put his leg down, then another kick and put his leg down. And what Durian Tan did was different. He was doing this kind of technique where he would actually raise his leg and hop forward, and this became something you saw a lot of other martial arts movie actors doing during this era. The flute, again, a key instrument of the Gongwu, of the martial world. Something else you saw in Chang Cheh's films, the idea of the wandering swordsman who sits lonely on a rock playing the flute, and either thinking about lost love or thinking about his brother-in-arms who may have died. These shots here you see in documentaries about martial art movies. These clips are used to talk about sword play, and you see the sword being forged. this is kind of a nice combination here of Taekwondo-style forms and Southern Chinese, because Taekwondo forms are pretty basic in terms of the hand technique, and the art itself becomes more it's more extravagant in terms of kicking. So Sammo kind of blending the two together. But some of those movements you just saw then from Durian Tan are very much like Taekwondo forms. And as I mentioned before, this is kind of a convention of the genre that you kind of have him redefining his skill to specifically counter the movements of the bad guy, played by James Tien. So anyway, when Durian Tan actually made the move from Korea to Taiwan, and he met the martial arts student called Liu Zhongliang, and he would Liu actually came to work for Durian Tan, and became his student, and would later go into movies as John Liu. So it was kind of thanks to John Liu. Later, when John Liu became an actor in his own right, both he and Durian Tan were of the same generation of kung fu heroes. Durian Tan made his own film debut in a movie in 1973 called Hero of the Waterfront, and which starred the wife of Jackie Chan, Joan Lin, who was who's to this day remains married to Jackie Chan, back when she was a famous star in Taiwan cinema, the Hero of the Waterfront. So there's kind of a family connection. In fact, that might be his Trivial Pursuit question, which Korean, kung fu actor appeared with both Mr. and Mrs. Jackie Chan in separate films. I think he may be the only person who can lay claim to that. I'm not sure. And he was in Hand of Death, and also the same year, 1976, The Hot, the Cool, and the Vicious, which is obviously inspired by the names of, it's got a kind of spaghetti western name to it, and he was paired there with an actor called Wong Do, who was a Chinese actor who was known for his Southern Fist technique, and he was in the movie Secret Rivals that MC Yun had produced, which again put Taekwondo or Northern leg kicking technique opposite a Wong Do's Southern Fist. But in Hot, the Cool, and the Vicious, it's Durian Tan with the Northern leg and Wong Do with Southern Fist. And then later, in 1982, he finally relocated to California to open the martial arts school, and he trained Shannon Lee there for her role in the Golden Harvest film Enter the Eagles. And he's now back and forth between, I believe, a school in Taiwan and his school in LA. But last I heard, the LA school was still there. Here we are back at the Kongling Temple. So really back and forward between Jeju Island, Jeju-do, and the Kongling Temple. But here you see these stupas, which are the key element of Kongling, Kongling meaning stupa. And here's John Woo himself as an actor, also often has cameos in his films. You see him in Bullet in the Head, you can see him in A Better Tomorrow. He always, it's a kind of Hitchcock thing to have a cameo. And here's the young, skinny John Woo, and depicted very much as this scholarly figure. It's interesting, he's kind of like Sun Yat-sen, because if you look at Sun Yat-sen and the way he was depicted in films, Sun Yat-sen being the founder of the Republic of China, and like somebody who's equally revered by the mainland Chinese and by the Taiwanese and by the Hong Kong people, he's a unique figure in that respect. You see him in movies portrayed as somebody who has to be protected by these warriors who lay down their life, but he himself never fights. He never shows even the slightest physical ability, and that's certainly true of John Woo's character here. He never does one single movement of martial art. He's the scholar who needs to be protected. Look at the background. That shot that you just saw, it's very evident that this is the same temple that was used for some of the exterior work on Warriors 2 when we established Casanova Wong's character fighting with the bad guys. So this temple obviously used a lot in films shot throughout this era. There's Yun Bu. This is Yun Bu's probably most obvious role in the film. Yun Bu, born in 1957. His real name is Ha-Ling Tan, and he just shot a TV series at TVB called Leung Jansen San, which is the same character he played in Prodigal Son, and he's got all the great kung fu actors coming back to work on TV, which is kind of interesting. So he's been, of late, not as active in filmmaking, unfortunately, but had his glory days under Sammo's patronage at Golden Harvest. In this era, he was working as a stuntman and all-purpose player, as you see him here in this supporting role as a Qing soldier, and then later would become a leading man in his own right, Knockabout, Prodigal Son, then later in Iceman Cometh and Kid from Tibet. Dozens of films subsequently. In recent years, his career he's been doing really low budget films in China, and just now have this kind of TV comeback. But this is his most prominent role in this movie as a traitorous Qing guy who gets killed with an arrow. This is probably the one role in the movie where he's playing kind of a real character, and the rest of the time it's stunt doubling and playing supporting roles. So at this period, he was young, slightly younger than Jackie and Samo, but incredibly gifted as a gymnast. And so really, you look at something like Magnificent Butcher, his fight with Lam Ching Ying, he really came into his own during this era, and he was as good as it gets. I don't know necessarily if he had complete all the package of charisma and at that time to become a leading man. Later, you see him in movies like Hero, not the classic, not the Zhang Yimou Hero, but the Hero, the remake of Boxer of Shantung that was made at Shaw Brothers, and he's become an amazing actor in his later career, but he didn't really have box office success. He had his box office success with the Kung Fu movies, and then when the Kung Fu movies went, his career kind of declined. Later he became a really good actor, but unfortunately the cinema of the time didn't really find appropriate vehicles for him. So hopefully he may yet come back and have a degree of success. That's Durian Tan using a metal pole, and this is another really beautiful shot, and really quite innovative of the time. And looking at the sword bringing with it this memory, it carries the weight of the blood, of the passions, love, hate. You know, these are the sword carries all of that, and this is kind of again a key element of this style of filmmaking. There's Jackie with his weapon of choice of this time, the spear. All of the opera guys learn to use the spear as part of their training, and so he gets to show it off to good effect here. This old guy we see running in, his name is Lo Wong, Wong Si-chun, and he was actually the on-set translator. He translated from Korean to Chinese and backwards, so everybody could understand everybody else. Great dubbing. I love he's got kind of the Wallace Beery dubbing in the English version of the movie. I love the dubbing of the old guy. He's got kind of great Western. He's like the old guy in the West. Oh, the bad words are coming over the hill. He's got that kind of voice, which is wonderful. But that was his job on set. He was the translator, and he got dragged in to play that little role when he comes running in to deliver the bad news. This is kind of like classic kind of like moment coming up here when they cut the hair of Durian Tan. And I think to audiences who aren't familiar maybe with the customs of the period, this actually was a major thing. This was actually something, again, talking about Sun Yat-sen, that he brought in with the Republic, the idea that people no longer would wear their hair in ponytails. The hairstyle was really regarded as an insult to the Han people, and they wanted to get rid of it. So, I mean, but the Qing had said, you have to have this specific hairstyle or we're going to kill you. So the cutting of the queue was signifying the fact that it was a new era and that you were rebelling against the kind of the corrupt, dying Qing regime. This is at Sun Yat-sen's time. So during this period, when the Qing was still had a ruling China with an iron fist, to cut off your ponytail was dangerous because it really indicated that you were going to rebel. And so this is why when this moment comes up later where Durian Tan's ponytail is cut off, this becomes like it's a major kind of like plot point. It's like really him fully embracing the fact that he's going to get the bad guy or die trying. I think if you're not familiar with the background of that, it's hard to see quite why they make a point of cutting his ponytail off. It comes across as almost like he's being attacked by them. And I remember the first time I saw the film, I thought, wow, this is a weird twist. These guys are actually going to be bad guys. And then later I realized that it was, they were kind of, there's a moment between them and he looks and then they do they mutually agree they're going to cut the ponytail. But today you actually see people, I guess, wanting to emulate old Kung Fu movies, even growing their hair in that style or wearing kind of makeup and hair appliances to look like those old Qing warriors, and I guess they're doing it in all innocence. But actually it's perceived as being an insult to the Han people of that era. So I think probably people should be a little bit more sensitive about recreating that in the modern times. But if you're doing movies set in that period, of course, it would be appropriate to have that particular hairstyle. The Ichimono with the weapon of choice, this is really a kind of this is, again, the kind of the established convention of the genre, that everybody has a specific weapon that, in a way, kind of reflects their character. So here's the moment with the eyes, the eye contact, which is kind of very Zhang Jin and also very John Woo. And this, again, I thought, wow, why are they attacking him? So now we finally get to see the real hairstyle of Durian Tan, because before he had a wig on, with the false hair and the ponytail. But that was kind of that whole, what my preamble then was really describing why this moment is particular. It's kind of a moment of liberation from the rule of the Qing. So that's why that moment is as it is. And then we go out, and they've got great the idea before having having a strategy of attack. Because in the old days, a lot of the times in kung fu movies, it was like, go out, find the bad guy, and keep swinging your arms at him until one of you falls down. That was the less sophisticated kung fu movies were like that. And here you have the application of battlefield tactics. Obviously, somebody's been reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War, so they're like it's an attack by drawing, which is another one, and a principle that Bruce Lee applied to his Jeet Kune Do. And as I mentioned before, I mean, this obviously was a real fort or a real fortress line that had been built in Korea, and it carries with it the weight of history of the battles that have been fought in Korea over this period. So I think it has a different feel to it than any set that would have been specially constructed. Like a Shaw Brothers movie, they would have specially built the set out of the Shaw Brothers lot on Clearwater Bay. But here it's an actual place that they're using. And there's Jackie showing off his skills with a horse. As I mentioned, everybody in Hong Kong of that era, it was like in the cowboy movie era in America, where everybody learnt to ride a horse and fire a 6-gun and bow and arrow and all these things. So it's the same thing in those days. Because kung fu movies were all the rage, you had to learn how horse riding and different skills, and everybody used to train in that in Hong Kong, and when they had time off between films. Great introductory shot here of Jackie. He's about to, for the first time in the movie, we really get to see him cut loose, and we see the real Jackie Chan. And watch out there, there's a moment coming up when a guy does a particularly acrobatic ride off the side. That's Yuen Biao again, doing that kind of plummet down the side of that little cliff face. So you can, if you freeze frame it, you go back and you can see it's Yuen Biao. Great seeing Jackie in action here. This is the young Jackie, and you can see why not years later, but shortly thereafter, Msian would kind of look at this guy and say, hey, here's somebody who has all the potential to be a kung fu movie star, but just hasn't been used in the right manner as yet. So they would look at his performances in films like this and go, okay, here's a guy, he's got the physical attributes, he's got this kind of comedic sensibility, he just hasn't been used properly. And so that was the kind of the trigger that led him to be cast in Snake in the Shadow and to become the major star, kung fu comedy star that he would become. The shot back then, you saw all the guys standing in the sunlight with nothing to do. I always wonder why at these temples in these movies, the bad guy temple, everybody's always standing there kind of in the hot sun, just waiting around for the good guys to attack. They never seem to have anything to do, just stand in the courtyard. So anyway, this is like a kind of a hyped up version of what you would see in Shaw Brothers of this era. Even now, I mean, Sammo's way of choreographing action, there was kind of a rhythm to it that was different to what you would see at Shaw Brothers. I mean, Shaw Brothers had as their mainstay action directors Lau Ga-leung and Tong Gai, and so they were much more tied to original classic kung fu, which I love as well, which is great. But the very different rhythm to what you saw here. Here was very much inspired by the drum beats of Chinese opera, and so you had a different rhythm and a different energy to it. And I think cinematically, probably these films worked for a broader audience. Quite tricky, by the way, the horse riding stuff. I mean, riding on a horse by yourself is tricky enough. Coordinating a bunch of people riding horses at the same time is more difficult still. This is great. I mean, the expanse of land that we see here, you couldn't even find at Shaw Brothers. So it really pays off to shoot in Korea and doing this era, because you can have those magnificent expanses. Township maybe doesn't look as good. There's a palanquin here, which would be the kind of a mode of transport for people in this era. Something you always see. I mean, there's always the this is always the target when somebody wants to attack a nobleman. They're normally traveling by palanquin, and so you constantly see these kind of being attacked by our heroes. Normally, the guy in the palanquin is the bad guy. So because in these films, always the wealthy, the Manchus, the Mandarins are the bad guys who are being attacked by the poor patriotic heroes. And I always think maybe one of the reasons Hong Kong cinema, these films are so popular, is that most people in Hong Kong are kind of poor. This era were poor, hard-working people, and you kind of see the movie, and you always have the underdog hero who comes out in the end. So they really felt some affinity for that character. It wasn't like a James Bond who was sipping his martinis and driving his Aston Martin. They liked somebody who was an underdog hero, oppressed by a foreign power, and who comes out by virtue of their Chineseness, their skill in kung fu, their knowledge of Chinese virtue, who comes out ahead by the end. That was kind of one of the elements of the appeal. But this is Jeju Island getting a wonderful, making wonderful use of Jeju Island, which is this great place of myth and history. Completely, you don't see them in this movie, but there's these stone statues, the dwarf-like Tol Harubang, who are actually were kind of put there to invoke the fertility god who would create a good harvest, and women having kids and animals giving birth to their young. And so it's like very strong land that was being developed by farmers, fishing communities, and a very popular tourist destination to this day. But here it really lends itself in terms of having all these different backdrops for the final sequence of the film. And as I mentioned before, it was interesting that the Jeju Island should be used as a location for this particular film, because the old Korean kingdom of Koryo was invaded by the Manchus and forced to bow down to the rule. These stone signs are very, very commonplace in movies of this era. You had hand signals and stone signs, and there's some of the kind of the natural wildlife of this island, of Jeju Island. But anyway, so there was a group of resistors, the Samyeolcho, who actually fought against both the ruling court of Koryo and against the Manchu, and they finally fled to this place, to Jeju Island, which we're seeing here, where they were annihilated by a combined force of both the Koryo, their own Korean people, and by the Manchus. So their blood kind of fell onto this ground. This is a flashback without the tint, and that's Yun Bu again doing his sword movement. By the way, there's a shot a while back with Jackie standing with the spear. It's happening again. The Jackie standing with the spear with John Woo and everybody behind him. That was used a lot for the cover artwork for this film that's been released on video and DVD. Now here's the deadly double act again of these two of happening on the right there, who's a kind of a veteran kung fu player and expert in martial arts, and his kind of his opposite number, who is you always get kind of like these players who used perpetually by Sammo because he knows their physical skills. So you've got Torwai War and Hat Ming as a double act here, and it works really well because the Sammo has this kind of unerring skill of how to kind of mix and match different weapon skills to great effect. So as I was mentioning before, there was this tragedy that had happened in the history of this island, of Jeju Island, and then after the defeat of the Samyeolcho, after these people had died fighting the Manchu, basically doing what we're seeing Jackie do here, fighting bravely against the Manchu and finally getting killed. The Jeju Islands were under the control of the Manchu, who used the island for horse breeding, and that's again is interesting because obviously the horses that we're seeing in all these sequences here with horseback, these horses were actually indigenous horses from Jeju Island, and so these would have been the horses that actually had been bred by the Manchus, by the Mongols. So there's kind of a sense of history being revisited in this particular film. And the Manchus actually kept control of the island for 100 years until finally the Korean government retook the islands and have maintained control over them to this day. So that's Jeju. So if you go to Korea, you might want to think about going over there to Jeju-do, to the Jeju Islands, and you can visit the location where they shot Hand of Death. So here's Jackie really got a fantastic showcase for his skills. And that's one great thing about working with Sammo. I mean, so many actors owe their subsequent career to Sammo because what he would do is not only would he see somebody's specific skill, but when he would show them off, he would look at the big picture. He wouldn't reserve all the best moments for himself in his films. He would find everybody would have their moment. And in this movie, he really does great service to Jackie, and I think it could be argued that this is the film that really made people look at, even though the film itself wasn't a success. It's such a great showreel for Jackie. You look at that and you go, wow, this guy could be a star, as indeed he became. As I mentioned earlier, the movie edited very well by Peter Jung Yi-jung, who was the editor of choice at the time at Golden Harvest. He edited the Michael Hoy comedies. He also edited Last Hurrah for Chivalry for John Woo, edited Dragon Lord and Project A, Dragons Forever, all these movies for Jackie and Sammo. Right up to Drunken Master 2, Fong Soyuk with Jet Li, and Who Am I, which is the last movie to date he edited for Jackie. So a very long career as an editor, and obviously somebody who Jackie had great cooperation with. There's a little bit of physicality there from John Woo, but as I see, we never get to see him actually do any fighting per se. Peter Chung, I mentioned, as editor, won the Hong Kong Film Award for Best Editing for Big Bullet, also for Jackie's film Crime Story, for Rouge, which was a ghost story produced by Jackie, and for a cop thriller called Long Arm of the Law. So really great range to his ability as an editor. I don't know, I think in America, I mean, editors tend to focus on specific genres of filmmaking, but here this guy could do anything. He also won the Golden Horse Award for Big Bullet, for Jet Li's Fong Sai-yuk, and for Jackie's film Police Story 3 Super Cop. And the DP, Liang Yongji, again, I think the technical, this particularly on this wonderfully cleaned up print, we get to see the technical, as they say in Variety, technical credit's fine, but there's nothing wrong with the cinematography of the movie. It was beautifully shot, given the fact that it wasn't a huge budget production. And the music for the movie by Joseph Koo Gafai, who's often partnered with the late, great James Wong. James Wong used to write the lyrics, and Joseph Koo wrote the music. And they wrote, Joseph Koo supplied the soundtrack for many of the classic films of this era. This is a movement that you see Jackie later use in Drunken Master. So obviously, everybody's kind of like got their encyclopedia of specific movements from film, and you see them kind of like recurring throughout people's later careers. It's kind of interesting. If you watch a whole bunch of kung fu movies, as I have, you kind of get to see the same moves kind of turning up in unusual places. I go back to Joseph Koo. At that time, composing soundtracks in Hong Kong was kind of a different discipline. People did compose original music, but a lot of the times what they would do is they would source music from other movies, American films, and kind of use them as the backdrop for Hong Kong action films. So Joseph Koo both composed songs and music for films, and also used music from other movies to kind of I guess it was a cheaper and quicker way to put a score together for a Hong Kong film. And he worked on movies like Deadly China Doll, aka The Opium Trail, starring Angela Mao, Bruce Lee's films Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon, A Man Called Tiger. He did the music for John Woo's films, A Better Tomorrow 1 and 2, which are particularly, those were specially composed scores and very striking. Did the music for Fist of Legend with Jet Li. He actually has only won Best Score once at the Hong Kong Film Awards for a kind of an unsung film, probably justifiably unsung film, Terracotta Warrior, which was director Zhang Yimou's love letter to Gong Li, a movie in which he and Gong Li both star. Zhang Yimou actually as an actor. So that was a movie where the score probably is better than the film itself, and won Best Score for Joseph Koo. As Sammo gave Jackie his great moment fighting, and then John Woo gives him his great dramatic moment here. So I think Jackie really well served by this film. You notice all the way through this final sequence, everybody's getting more and more tanned as it progresses. Here we get to see the kind of the rock formations of Jeju Island. They always say that Jeju Island was said to have 3 plenties and 3 lacks. The 3 plenties are stones, wind, and women. And I think we don't get to see the women, this being a John Woo movie, but we get to see the stones and the wind. And all the houses and fields have these stone walls around them to protect them from the strong sea wind. That's what we're seeing here. Sammo is a boatman, which is, you also see him play a real boatman in the movie Odd Couple. So this is kind of referencing that. And great chance to see Sammo in action, and he's probably grateful to be outside of his Manchu robes for this particular scene in the heat. That kind of crane technique, we saw at the very beginning of the film being used by Wilson. Here's Mr. Kim coming into action, and he's a great bad guy actor. I mean, I loved him in Skyhawk and also in King Boxer. Always good to see, even briefly, to see Sammo in action, because, I mean, he's unquestionably my idol in terms of on-screen kung fu on-screen kung fu exponents. Look at this. It's the Yellow Pages. So it's not what he thinks it's going to be. So there's always the MacGuffin of this movie is this map showing the whereabouts of the rebel bases. So it's kind of like a Star Wars thing in a way. Here's a kind of a real classic thing of this era is going back and forward between different beats of action in the finale. And actually they were cutting back and forward. Sammo mentioned to me between some of the scenes that we see here were shot in Seoul and some on Jeju Island. And so you were kind of going back and forward. Some of this is in Seoul and some of it's in Jeju Island. And he couldn't remember why, but for logistical reasons, they had to go back and forward between the two. Obviously, the stuff where you see the water and you see the rocks is Jeju Island. Oh, I should mention that I said they got the three plenties and 3 lacks. The lacks are beggars, thieves, and locks. And famous for on the shoreline, women would dive for shellfish. So many people, many generations made their living from the sea. So this backdrop that we see here with this fishing, this actually was indigenous to the people of Jeju Island, Jeju-do. So it was kind of obviously was there, and they decided to make a location of it. And it's, again, tough work filming. Obviously, in the heat of the Korean summer, pretty tough to be out there fighting. Look how dark Samo had got by this point. It's moving so well. But it was like I hope those pots were actually put there as props and they didn't actually belong to some poor fisherman who'd gone off for the day. He'd be pretty pissed to come back and find that his pots were smashed up. This you saw coming 2 reels ago. These is the bad guys. And this, all very Jeonji, the idea of this guy getting penetrated by from the back by these knives. And kind of it's out of left field in a way. I mean, you saw these bad guys coming, but the idea that he could be this master swordsman is kind of betrayed and murdered, with relative ease, and right at the finale was quite something. So we get to see John Woo, master boatman. We've seen him as a director, we've seen him as an actor, and now he's going to have to pilot this thing to safety. And again, very much equivalent of Sun Yat-sen. He's the guy with the plan, and all the warriors are falling to keep him safe. So this is the sacrifice of the master swordsman, who's known, by the way, as billed as Zorro in some prints of the film, which I think is kind of fun. This is Samo again doing a brief example of showing off his southern skills. And there's actually a great movie called The Tournament. Maybe not as a film, not that great, but it's got some great action in a fight where Samo gets to show off his kung fu skills in a fight with Angela Mao. Little scene movie from the 70s. And a lot of that stuff, I can't wait for it to come out on DVD again because, I've been lucky enough to see it being based here in Hong Kong. But films like that and Hapkido, I think the modern generation haven't really had a chance to watch lately, and it'd be great when those films come out again so we can see the great Samo at the height of his powers. And this is kind of also as action director, it's kind of fun. He gets to come in and beat himself up. He gets to come in and choreograph a way for he himself to get beaten up by the heroes, because in this era, when he was action director, normally he was playing the bad guys. And Sam actually the other day was telling us some ghost stories, telling us about a time when he was in, I think it was Indonesia, and there was some mysterious flying rocks. But that was another interesting story. We're talking about ghosts, and very interesting life Samo has had. Somebody really needs to write his biography, I think, because look how he's so tanned. I mean, he'd be out there. These guys really were suffering in this sunlight. So, as I mentioned, this is Jeju Island, and there are no beggars, no thieves, and no locks. So people wouldn't really have to lock their doors. And they used to have like 3 bars placed across the entrance of the doors. And if one bar was missing, it meant the owners were out. Which I can't imagine anywhere in the world where that would be a practice, an established practice, to come out and say, hey, by the way, we're out. You wouldn't advertise that in many countries of the world. So here are the real deal patriots, and again, that kind of significant hand gesture. These guys are very evidently Korean, by the way, Korean extras. You can tell from their face structure. They look very different from the Chinese. The majestic hills, the hills of Jeju. You get like Mount Halasan, which is 1,950 meters, and it's the highest peak in Korea, visible from all over the island. So that was actually in the background there, and you see a wonderful setting for this finale, and that's I presume is Mount Halasan in the background there, as we have a background for the throwdown. And it always comes down to this, and what I love about Kung Fu movies, it comes down to a very straightforward clash of good and evil. And I think there is a cathartic sense, because most of us in our lives cannot deal with the frustrations, the evil or bureaucracy, and all the things in our lives that frustrate us cannot be dealt with in this direct manner. So you kind of invest yourself in the character of somebody like Durian Tan, who gets to face off his enemies in a very direct way, and he has nothing to rely on but his own courage and his own skills. Again, we get the hard-working Yun Bu in this sequence here, as he gets to do that stunt off a horse, and then there's he gets kicked off. They see the close-up. That's actually Yun Bu getting kicked off of a horse, and then he's back again in a moment. I mean, basically, this guy, you didn't. No one worked harder at this time than Yun Bu. Pulls it, and that's Yun Bu again flying through the air. So he actually gets killed off 2 times, and then when you get the close-up, it's a Korean actor, Korean horse stuntman. That's a pretty good stunt. with the insert shot of the spear going in. And then we've established earlier this kind of truncated version of the guando, which is like a weapon that you see in classical Chinese martial arts as being the weapon of choice of James Tien. And there, the mountain in the background, and really the classic kung fu standoff, which is like, I think it's like, one of the things that fans like myself of the genre really appreciate is when it comes down to this kind of like one-on-one combat. I always think it's kind of, I suppose it's unrealistic, to have weapon against empty hands, but it's kind of a convention of the genre that you actually see that. I always think this, to me, makes much better sense when you have it like this, when you have people actually matching weapons. Full respect to Durian Tan in this sequence, because as I mentioned earlier, he didn't really train in weapons arts prior to doing movies, so he really had to learn this stuff kind of on the set. So this is kind of this is really what defines somebody who can actually have a career in action cinema. If you have that kind of mind where you can take on board movements from unfamiliar styles and perform them in a convincing manner, like you are a master, then you can really, this era, you could really work in the films. If not, then, you were limited because you just could do whatever a taekwondoist could do. That was Wong Jan-Lee's great strength. He was somebody who could do Chinese kung fu mantis style, whatever style of movement you wanted, he could adapt it, even though it wasn't an indigenous part of his own system. A fantastic backdrop. This is James Tien really showing us some of his movement, which is inspired by the opera. That was his background, was Taiwanese, the Chinese opera in Taiwan. But also at this time, there was no training school, like Shaw Brothers had a training school. Golden Harvest didn't. And what you'd have to do is you would actually learn on the job, you would learn on the set. And so a lot of these guys, you can't say that they're martial artists in terms of going to a martial arts school and training with a sifu or a sensei. But you could say that these are guys who had really extensive martial arts training on the sets at Golden Harvest. There's a fantastic opportunity to see this kind of the classic southern fist versus northern leg, and easy to see why Durian Tan has a fan following. He's one of these guys. He's one of the best looking of the boot men coming out in this era, and had some charisma and screen presence. He wasn't ever completely embraced by the Hong Kong movie-going audience, but I think subsequently he's got a great fan following. Tracking shot here, which relatively little seen at this time in Hong Kong film. Sammo always stretching the boundaries of the genre, and fantastic. That's another shot that you see a lot of images from. And look at that, boom, boom. And then I remember Toby Russell saying he should have gone up again at the end there and done another high kick. But it still looks fantastic, that crisp, clean line of the taekwondo kicking. And the idea, the concept that he's actually developed timing that will allow him to counter the physical movements, that's kind of like a feint, which is a speciality of James Tien, but he can actually time his movement now to kind of get over that particular hurdle and apply his techniques to get through the defenses of his adversary. But James Tien, great. I mean, in the great tradition of kung fu villains. I mean, he's got a bit of the Bai Mei about him. Bai Mei, Bak Mei character you saw in Kill Bill 2, and I think he carried it off really well. But as is always the case with Bai Mei, finally comes to his own. Yun Bu again doing this acrobatic flip at the end for James Tien. And he's kind of like, I think his acting is very strong here, James Tien. You really get a sense of here's a guy who's going to go down fighting. There's the hopping that I talked about earlier, which was the technique, the style that had been devised by Durian Tan for competitive purposes, but applied here to filmmaking, and it became kind of, I think, it's a trademark of his. It's not a style that the other Korean martial arts movie performers were using. Sammo really pulling out everything here. Wham! Look at that. That's just incredible, the power and range of the kicks of Taekwondo. And he really wanted to show them off to good effect. And always tough to kind of come up with a finishing move that's going to match what's come before. But they come pretty damn close here. People said to me they thought the ending of this movie was anticlimactic. I didn't feel that way. I thought it really, bam, Just what's powerful to me is when you have something happening in the frame, which you had then, of just the crunch of the guy coming in and getting kicked with a midsection. If you've ever done martial arts, you kind of know what that feels like. So the hero rises, and Hand of Death, a film that over the years I think becomes ever more fascinating because you can see the early charisma of Sammo Hung and Jackie Chan, the early directorial skills of John Woo, and people who've gone to greater work. But because this is them really finding their way in the early stages, it's a film well worthy of re-examination and a lot to enjoy about it. It's been my great pleasure to watch it again with you. So this is Bey Logan at the end of Hand of Death, signing off as we leave Jeju Island in Korea. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your continued support for Hong Kong Legends and for Hong Kong cinema in general. I hope we can continue to be worthy of that support. Sayonara, Joy Gin, Jai Jen, Auf Wiedersehen.